Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous et bienvenue dans ce lieu de rassemblement culturel du Centre de santé autochtone Wabano. My name is Jody Chufo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. First, I wish to acknowledge that this event is taking place on Algonquin territory and would like to invite Elder Irene Lindsay to deliver an opening prayer. Elder?
Good evening. On behalf of our friends from Algonquin Territory, I welcome everybody here tonight. My name is Irene Lindsay. I was born in Wannerobata, Saskatchewan. I went to the residential school in Duck Lake, Saskatchewan for 8 years. I'm a mother of 6 and a grandmother of 9 and 4 great-grandchildren. My spirit name is Eagle Eye Woman. I'm from the Wolf Clan, from the Cree Nation. It's an honor to be here tonight with all these people that know how to build things. Especially this building here, it's beautiful. And it's amazing what we can do when we get together and the things that we can put together. We ask the Creator to guide us here tonight as we spend this time together, and to remember the things that we do for one another, the things that we learn from each other, and the things that we need to get on to things to make it better for ourselves and for our little ones, the ones that are going to be taking over our jobs pretty soon. So these are the things that we need to teach our children. It's very important that they always come first. Because in my time, we didn't have that part where we were raised by our families because we went to the residential school. And this is very important for me to always talk about the child. They need their family. They need their mother and dad beside them. So these are the things that I talk about. These are the things I preach. And I work with the women, the Women's Support Center. It's called Minwashin Lodge. And I've been with them for years. And a lot of times these women need help. So I'm there to be there for them. I build them up, make them strong, so they can have an organized and calm way of living and raising their kids. So these are the things that are important to me in my life. And also, I always think about the elders that are sick, the ones that need help. Let us hope that somebody's looking after them. And our little ones, the ones that are on the streets, the ones that are cold and hungry at night and need shelter. These are some of the little ones that I pray for all the time. And for our sisters in spirit that died in violence, let us pray for their families that are agonizing over a loved one today. And for our people, the ones that are dying of AIDS, may they have a loved one there as they pass on to the Creator's kingdom. There is only love and peace there for them. And for us that are here tonight, let us ask the Creator to keep us strong and guide us through our each personal journey that we're traveling, to do the things that we need to do to help the people that need it, and to honor each other each day for the things that we do. It's very important to remember that time when we wake up in the morning, we get up from the east each morning, and the eagle sits in that direction that gives us clarity of vision as we walk down that daily spiritual journey we always do every day of our life. We walk down that. The 7 grandfather teachings sits on this line. These are the 7 grandfather teachings that we use every day when we do our work, the things when we look after our children, when we do other things for other people. And we go to sleep at night in the west where the bear sits, that gives us that balance of life. So we ask the Creator to keep us strong in these times and to always remember to focus on the things that are more important and always the things that come from here. That's the important thing. So let us have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder Lindsay. We appreciate your being here. Et j'aimerais également remercier le trio Alex Bilodeau pour la belle musique qu'il nous a fait entendre pendant la réception. Alors, I'm so pleased that you have joined us to share in this very special occasion, the investiture of the 77th President of the RAIC, Alan Taramura. We have many distinguished guests with us this evening, including representatives from Parliament Hill, government departments, and First Nations, as well as allied professionals, members, fellows, past presidents of the RAIC, and many others engaged in the challenging and rewarding field of architecture. Among them is Douglas Cardinal, architect of this spectacular space. He was hoping to be here tonight. I don't believe he's yet made it, but if I could quote from the Wabano Center's opening ceremonies, Executive Director Alison Fisher said, "It takes foresight to know that space isn't just bricks and mortar. It's beauty. It revolves around optimism. It is a trust in the power of space to humanize us, to protect us, and to enrich us." And so today's presidential investiture gives us the opportunity to honor the trust that society places in the profession to create spaces where we all belong. And now, please welcome our first speaker this evening, Samuel Ogale Obo, who served as the 2015 RAIC president. Welcome, Sam.
Okay, thank you, Jody. Can't believe that it's already a year, and a number of people have asked, how do you see if the time has gone very fast or if it's gone very slow? But I always say it all depends on the perspective you look at it. I think, the time is just right, to pass the baton to Alan Taramura. So thank you, Dr. Christensen, for being here, and our keynote speaker, Joseph Boyden. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, one of the greatest privileges I enjoyed in 2015, apart from still being married to my wife and parents to my kids, is having the honor of serving as the 76th president of the RAIC. Last year, the RAIC was in the news more than we've ever been in recent times. And people have taken notice. Initiatives that we championed and led yielded results and attracted significant attention from mainstream national and international media outlets. One of such initiatives is the coalition that we led to ensure due process is followed and the right decisions made regarding the controversial Victims of Communism monument, previously slated on the Judicial Precinct, just right by the Supreme Court building, and we all know how that went. In retrospect, the RAIC has had an excellent year in 2015, starting with an unequivocal charge from John Ralston Saul, one of Canada's leading public intellectuals, urging architects to demonstrate how architecture can be used as a regenerative force to address the challenges faced by Canada's Indigenous peoples. These challenges revolve around cultural rights, housing rights, environmental rights, and recognition of the rights of Indigenous people. We entered the year feeling pretty buoyant, confident, and energized by Mr. Saul's charge to us to be true to our vision of demonstrating how design enhances the quality of life, and we did. In 2015, The RAIC signed a record number of memoranda of understanding with various national and international organizations pertinent to our mission. These organizations include the National Capital Commission led by Dr. Chris Manson, the Royal Institute of British Architects, the New Zealand Institute of Architects, and the Canada Green Building Council. Our outreach to provincial regulators from coast to coast to coast enhanced our relationship with signed MOUs with British Columbia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and Labrador, and a host of others. The RAIC represented the Canadian architecture profession at various international fora, including the COP21 conference session on architecture in Paris in November 2015 with the International Union of Architects. We contributed to discussions on climate change with thought leaders from around the world. We also engaged with ministers, premiers, lieutenant governors, and even the Prime Minister to promote good design culture in Canada. Running a non-profit organization has its challenges. The great news is that in 2015, we met all our challenges with the enthusiasm of a dedicated and resourceful staff, team under the able leadership of Interim Executive Director Bruce Larmer. I don't know if Bruce is here tonight, but yeah. And under the guardianship of a supportive board of directors. I would like to say that much of the credit of the success achieved under my leadership in 2015 goes to the man we are here to honor today, Alan Teramura. Alan is a man I admire for his temperament, thoroughness, agility, sense of humor, energy, dedication, and loyalty. I can go on and on. Actually, the list is longer, Alan, but Maria told me to keep it short. Alan has proven to be an invaluable, asset to the RAIC, and I'm delighted I'm leaving the RAIC in good hands. So please, just allow me, to say a few words about my relationship with RAIC staff. I have a lot of good things to say about Amanda, Angie, Chantal, Daniel, Etienne, Jody, Jonathan, Karen, Maria, and Natalie. They have been very supportive in helping me to articulate and actualize all priorities I identified at the start of my presidency. What a tremendous compliment of what a tremendous compliment of staff the RAIC has. I think these people deserve more credit for all we achieved in 2015 than I ever will. So I would like a round of applause for the staff. And look at that. Yeah, thank you. Of course, I would be derelict in my duty if I did not mention that I could not have achieved or done anything without the unflinching support and love of my friend, partner, and wife, Aisha, who actively bore the brunt of my heavily loaded schedule, long hours of work, sleepless nights, and thankless times away from home. What's more astonishing is the fact that she did all this selflessly and expecting absolutely nothing in return, and I think that's really very great. Maybe the promise of a cruise vacation after I hand over to Alan will probably did the magic. But if I had not known Aisha for decades, I would have been worried about her not expecting anything in return. And I'll probably have to advise myself to always sleep with my eyes open. But thankfully, no need to do that. And I thank, Aisha profusely for, everything. And to my kids, Fego and Riva, I thank them. To my colleagues, friends, and members of the RAIC everywhere that you're around, I say thank you from the depth of my soul, and I'm truly humbled to have served as the 2015 president of the RAIC. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I wouldn't dream to speak on behalf of your family, but on behalf of the staff, we really love you back, and thank you for everything. J'aimerais maintenant inviter M. Mark Christmanson, le premier dirigeant de la Commission de la Capitale Nationale. Dr. Christmanson is a champion of great design and is a true friend of the RAIC. We're delighted to have him here to take part in our ceremony today. Please welcome Dr. Christmanson.
Thank you very much, and greetings to incoming President Alan Teramura and past President Sam Ulobo. It's been great to get to know you over the past couple of years. I've been CEO of the NCC since February 2014, so it's coming up to 2 years. And I must say, one of the great pleasures of my role is to meet with you. And there are many people in this room who've come to my table to talk to various things. Or we've Raymond, it's very nice to see you here tonight, and many others. And so it's a very great pleasure to be here. I'd like to also thank the elder for her words at the opening. So. This ceremony culminates a century of tradition of the RAIC. It's an idea that was seeded back at the time that roughly the creation of the forerunners of the National Capital Commission were created. C'est également au début des années 19e siècle, précisément en 1903, que M. Frédéric Todd a préparé un rapport exhaustif pour la Commission d'amélioration d'Ottawa au sujet de la croissance future de la capitale nationale. And architecture has a place in what I think of as the elegant phrasing of the NCC's founding legislation. This legislation tasks us with the planning, development, conservation, and improvement of the National Capital Region, such that the nature and character of the seat of the federal government reflects its national significance. I think that mandate has stood the test of 60 or so years. And as such, there's a synergy between the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada and the National Capital Commission that extends back over that century. And it's endured despite some bumps along the way. Last year in 2015, in meeting with Sam, we did reach a memorandum of understanding with the RAIC. This was a very profitable set of meetings that Maria coordinated. And so we do have a formal protocol to exchange information, to work together on design excellence, to share best practices, to work on our staff's professional development, and to work on policy development. It was also a year marked by the Victims of Communism Memorial incident, really. I don't know what to call it. And this is really, I'm really setting up for Joseph to come and speak, and so it's not the night to go into this. But I'd love to have a chance someday to come and speak to the Institute and actually have a discussion about that whole saga and that story, which one day I'll write the official story of, which is much more complex than the media presented. L'an dernier, nous avons eu le plaisir d'officialiser notre association avec la signature d'un protocole d'entente conçu spécifiquement dans le but de formaliser notre relation symbiotique et de travailler ensemble à l'excellence de design dans la région de la capitale nationale. It's my great privilege tonight to introduce our keynote speaker, Joseph Boyden. He's an award-winning Canadian novelist and short story writer whose work focuses on the historical and contemporary experience of First Nations people of Canada, specifically Northern Ontario. He was born in Toronto, where he studied at the Brebeuf College School and York University. Par la suite, il a fréquenté l'Université de Nouvelle-Orléans. Il est devenu très connu au Canada, mais aussi à l'international, suite à la publication de son premier roman intitulé 3-Day Road en 2005, et pour lequel il a reçu de nombreux prix. His second novel, Through Black Spruce, won the 2008 Scotiabank Giller Prize, and his third novel, The Orenda, was published in 2013, and it won the 2014 edition of the Canada Reads competition. So congratulations on that great series of works and recognitions. Just last month, he was appointed a member of the Order of Canada, and in the citation, Joseph is recognized for his contribution as a gifted storyteller. for his social engagement, and for his committed support for our First Nations. Il est actuellement à la faculté d'écriture créative à l'Université de la Colombie-Britannique à Vancouver et à l'Institute of American Indian Arts à Santa Fe au Nouveau-Mexique. And prior to welcoming Joseph to the podium, I'd like to highlight or draw from a quote that he gave last year to the Globe and Mail, speaking of Native culture and philosophy. He reflected on the elders, saying that it's going to take 7 generations to heal us, and that's a long time. And it made me think of the architectural expression of that recovery, that long recovery. And I thought of Douglas Cardinal and his great works in our region, including this building. I thought of the new structures at Wendake and that the Nisga'a have created, the beautiful museum there, and the new Welcome Center at Haida Gwaii. These structures are the markers of what Joseph has described as a 100-year patience to complete the sea change from ignorance to understanding. So, with these words of wisdom and optimism, I invite you to join me in warmly welcoming Joseph Boyden.
It's very much a pleasure to be here. I wish to recognize the land upon which we sit and stand today, the unceded Algonquin territory, Miigwech. Ani Buju, hello. Thank you, Miigwech Elder, for the beautiful prayer to bring us into this. I'm going to just jump right in. I'm honored to be invited to speak at the investiture of Alan Taramura. I'm fascinated by his discussion of northern reserves such as Kashechewan and Attawapiskat, and how to Alan they resemble internment camps. This struck a deep chord in me as I know these northern reserves well, having taught and lived in many, including the 2 mentioned. And I don't believe I've come across a more startling and accurate comparison. And Alan, in his opening remarks, speaks to how we must give agency back to these communities, as well as how we must incorporate cultural value in any investments made in these communities. He's dead right. Please understand me that the plight of the Northern Reserve doesn't just exist in Ontario. Right across this country, there are hundreds of reserves existing in subpar conditions, to put it mildly. The days of blaming the victim, I want to believe, are over. Our nation is only as good as its most vulnerable. This country teems with good people wanting to make things right, especially with our First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And so how do we begin to gather these forces of good people? How do you, as architects, enter the fray? Mr. Taramura, to quote him, says, "Reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples is the most important issue of our time. Civil society organizations, such as professional associations, can have a key role to play. Bound by our ethical and professional standards, we have an obligation to speak plainly if we see a problem." Again, I believe Alan's dead on, and I think you've picked a really good president, by the way. I'm always the first to admit that I don't have all of the answers, but what I can try and accomplish with you tonight is to tell you a few stories that hopefully might give you a bit of the background, to try and shade in some of the history and life on certain northern reserves. I'm a storyteller, so I'd like to share these 3 stories tonight that I hope bring to life a place and a people that hopefully gives you a perspective in which to see a part of Canada that is so often such a completely alien world to most of us. I will present this talk in 3 acts, because a 3-act structure is classy. Act 1, utilitas. In order to be useful, in order to serve our best purpose, we must see the place upon which we want to build through the lens, through the eyes of the inhabitant. I once remembered an Anishinaabe and Ojibwe elder praying over his food before eating, and I asked if he was Christian. "Yes and no," he said. "The Christian in me," he said, "prays only to God in thanks, but the Indian in me prays to all the animals in thanks." And then he told me the following story, and it was like the light bulb in the cartoons turning on above my head. Suddenly I saw the world in a way I hadn't known existed before. It's a simple story, but the best ones usually are. Me and that elder talked about how Christianity is in some ways very similar to the Anishinaabe spiritual world. Take care of one another, share, live life well, for it is a gift given to us from the Creator. Do not steal. But in some ways, Christianity and the sacred teachings of the Anishinaabe are not more opposite. This is the example the elder shared with me. In the Christian worldview, God created all of the animals, the lakes and rivers and oceans, the forests, the mountains and valleys, and then, last but certainly not least, he created man. And man was put on this earth as the ruler of it, as the boss. The animals, the plants, the trees, all of the flora and fauna were his, to do with what he pleased. The earth is God's gift to man, and man wanders it as its ruler. God put the animals on the planet for us to eat and make clothing from. He created rivers and lakes and oceans for us to travel on and harvest food from, and even, like in Montreal recently, to dump our waste into. He gave us trees to use for heat and for building material. There certainly is an order to the animal kingdom in Christianity, and man rules the roost. In the Anishinaabe spiritual world, though, our place in it is seen a little differently. 2 simple questions, the elder told me, must be asked. First, what do we humans need of the physical world in order to survive? An easy question, right? We need the animals for food and for clothing. We need trees for heat and for shelter. We need water for thirst, oil to drive our cars and airplanes. We need the animals that live in the water for sustenance. We need the soil to grow vegetables. We even need the simplest rock for a multitude of purposes. The list goes on and on and on. But the more interesting question is this: what in the physical world needs humans to survive? Think about it. Even domesticated animals easily turn back into the wild again. Do moose need us? Do pickerel or pike or sturgeon? Do trees or grass or dirt or rocks? Of course not. I thought about this, thought about my rescue chihuahua. He'd certainly go feral if I let him. In fact, sometimes I find him gnawing on my leg when I haven't fed him in a few hours. Let's just put it this way, the Anishinaabe elder said. The physical world doesn't need humans at all in order to thrive. In fact, it would probably do better without us around. And so how, we ask, can we consider ourselves at the top of the animal kingdom, the masters of the earth? Are we really at the top of the totem pole, to use a wonderfully wrong-headed expression? Of course not. We're actually at the bottom. Yes, I can feel certain people shuddering at the thought. Nothing on the land needs us for its survival, but we need everything from the atomic particle level up. And so this is why the elder leaned over his plate of food and thanked it. The animal and the plants on his plate in front of him had given themselves willingly in order that he might survive. Because everything, the elder believes, contains a spirit. And the animals sometimes give themselves to us willingly so that we humans might continue to survive. A simple whisper of thanks is the least we can offer in return. Residential schools were first dreamed up in the last decades of the 1800s to try, in part, to quash this type of thinking, to try and dismantle this view of the world, to, as the Canadian government openly and proudly pronounced to a new nation, kill the Indian in the child in order to save the man. This might sound like harsh rhetoric, and it was, and you should have seen this rhetoric in action. I'm not here to lecture on residential schools, but I do wish just a very brief thumbnail sketch of the residential school system in this country. Begun in the 1880s, dreamed up by some of our first federal governments, the idea behind it was to bring the Indians into the fold, to bring them onto reserves, to control them, and to eventually make them into good first-class citizens, into good white people. Residential school at its heart was the practice of physically and often forcefully taking children from their parents at the age of 4 or 5 or 6, putting them into institutions that were anything but like those children's homes, where they ate food that was foreign to them, dressed in clothes that were foreign to them, were given haircuts that were foreign to them, were not allowed to speak to their siblings if their siblings were in the same school, the whole idea being that we must separate them and break them down in order to build them up again. I could go on and on about the dangers and damages and horrors of residential school, of which there are many and many, and they're finally beginning to come to light. And I'm really happy, which is a strange word to use, I'm happy to begin understanding that more and more Canadians are beginning to at least acknowledge and understand the residential system, 7 generations. I think it's incredibly important. I think we all understand that it's incredibly important to understand our complete history. The last residential school in this country did not close its doors until 1996, so this is not a thing of the past. There's something I believe in called intergenerational trauma that continues to roll forward. First Nations, if you're a First Nations person, you were not allowed to vote until the 1960s in this country. If you're a First Nations woman and you married a white man up until 1984 or so, you lost your identity completely and your status as a First Nations person. So there's all of these things. And again, these schools were places, too many, of most often quiet horror, but sometimes very loud horror. Physical and mental abuse were just par for the course. Sexual abuse, unfortunately, was a real and very, very frightening danger for people. And so we've got generation after generation after generation of children being taken away from their parents, raised in these cold institutions, not allowed to speak their language, practice their religions, do their dances, sing their songs, play their instruments, up until rather recently. And so when you're taken away as a child from those who raise you and raised in a cold institution, and then you go ahead and have children who are then in turn taken away from you, generations of this obviously are going to have a very damaging and lasting effect. And this is something, again, I'm not here to preach. It's just a thumbnail sketch of what many hundreds of thousands of First Nations people in this country went through and why there is continuing repercussions of this. And so when we see reserves like Saskatchewan that look like internment camps, we must understand that the government was really successful in its policy of killing the Indian and the child in order to save the man. When I first traveled to the west coast of James Bay in the mid-1990s, many houses had no running water or insulation against minus 40-degree winters, or often electricity because the power plant would go out. There was certainly no sense of pride in home. If you live on a reserve, you don't own your home. You can't go to a bank and take out a loan using your home as equity. You reside in a residence that isn't your own, and not in a real and fundamental sense. And when you incorporate the cost of building in the north, well, we're beginning to create a perfect storm of third world conditions. Utilitas, it's about meeting the functional needs of the occupants, the efficient arrangement of space. There are many reserves that are successful examples of Utilitas in action. This is not a pan-Indigenous problem, but it's the reserves off of our radar that seem to be suffering the most. Act 2, Firmitas. And so what is the fallout of this, of generations of attempted cultural genocide, a term used by a member of the highest court in this land, a term that Indigenous people have deeply understood for many decades? Sadly, this fallout is a 40% graduation rate for First Nation high school students in this country, 40%. It's suicide rates in the north that are often 100 times higher than the national average. It is that Indigenous women are 4 times more likely to die violently than any other group of women in this nation. This, admittedly, Act 2 is the tough part of my talk tonight. It is in many ways the darkness before the light. If we wish Firmitas, if we wish structural integrity, we have to carefully examine the fallout of really, really bad social engineering and architecture as we move forward in our blueprints for reconciliation. The story I'm going to share next isn't an easy one to share, and thankfully it isn't just one of bleakness, but I hope of real hope as well. A Cree woman I've known for many years up in Moosonee, Ontario, has been in such anguish that I fear for her life. This anguish, this word, can't begin to describe her tortured suffering. She lives every day walking through what most of us would consider our worst nightmare. Not so long ago, her 17-year-old son, while at a house party full of friends, walked from the kitchen where he'd found a short indoor extension cord, through the crowded living room to the bedroom, and eventually into a closet. There, he wrapped the end of the cord around his neck, and leaving a foot or two, he tied the other end around the clothes rod. This thin young man, pimples on his chin and black hair he wore short and spiky, knelt so that his full weight took up all the slack. In this way, he slowly strangled himself to death. If you have the fortitude, think about that for a minute. He could have stopped at any time. He could have simply stood up to take the pressure off. Possibly he did once or twice or 3 times when the fear of what awaited overcame him, when the happy noise of his friends in the rooms next door drifted in, muffled. But eventually, with unbelievable will, with a drive he'd never exhibited in his young life before, he managed this gruesome act of self-destruction. I attended the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's first annual gathering at the Forks in Winnipeg a number of years ago. Residential school survivors, along with their families, came together from all across Canada. The first day alone, an estimated 20,000 people gathered to speak about their experiences or to see old friends or soak up the evening concert that included Buffy Sainte-Marie and Blue Rodeo. Despite the rather festive feel of the first day, the pain, the same anguish that my Cree friend feels, was palpable just below the surface. The sunny skies turned to rain the next couple of days, as if in mimicry. An Anishinaabe medicine man I know, when he speaks of the creation of residential schools, says that a door was opened that should never have been unlocked. For Westerners, his rather poetic view might be comparable to letting a sinister genie out of a bottle. One of the many evils that escaped out that door, the medicine man believes, is the tremendously high Aboriginal youth suicide rate in our country. He believes, as do many, that this suicide epidemic is a direct effect of residential schools where generation after generation of families were torn apart by the system. What's certainly fact is that suicide among Aboriginal groups before residential schools was almost unheard of. As I've mentioned, this Cree woman in Moosonee, my friend, has lived in anguish since the suicide of her son. Her 15-year-old daughter did as well. She was close to her brother and went through most all of the stages of grief, disbelief, anger, a stabbing sadness. But she wasn't able to make it to that last stage, acceptance. 5 months after her brother was found hanged at the party, my Cree friend found her daughter hanged, this time in her own closet at home, and this time actually kneeling, leaning slightly forward as if in deep prayer. How does a mother go on after that? This Cree woman, my friend, she's from that tiny isolated James Bay Reserve named Kashechewan, 160 kilometers as the bush plane flies north of Moosonee. Kashechewan is like 100 other northern Canadian reserves, but unlike most, and as I mentioned, Kashechewan made the papers a handful of years ago when more than 20 youth attempted suicide in a single month. I remember reading about it on page 5 of the Globe and Mail and not being surprised. I'd lived and taught up there. The reserve's reputation preceded it. People in Moosonee warned me each time when I was to travel to Cache and spend a few days a week teaching adult community members reading and writing skills. These people said, be careful. It's a dangerous place. It's a rough reserve. A lot of people up there are crazy. No warnings ever, and strangely, I might admit, more specific than that. What I found were a lot of amazing people who became dear friends. And I found a sadness difficult to define, lingering just below the surface of day-to-day living. My Cree friend, now the mother of 2 dead children, she'd left Kashechewan to live in Moosonee years ago, which to her mind was moving to a big town, in part to escape that insidious sadness of her reserve. It's the same sadness I can feel seeping from residential school survivors as I wander through the first annual gathering at the Forks. Groups huddle in large tents, rain popping on the roofs. They sit in circles and take turns speaking about their experiences. Some are resigned and speak matter-of-factly, others in hiccups and sobs. There are very few dry eyes, and my initial feeling that I'm eavesdropping on something I shouldn't dissipates when someone invariably cracks a joke and smiles light up the circle. My Cree friend didn't know then what she knows now, that this sadness I speak of, this hurting, isn't only isolated in Cache. This hurting is spread across the northern reserves and heavily Indian communities of Canada. It spreads more easily than H1N1, and it's been infecting northern communities for many years. It's deadlier than any epidemic since the smallpox and tuberculosis eras. The oldest son of one of my dearest friends in the world, he's made something of himself. He's a young Moose Cree man with a brand new wife and a brand new career as an OPP officer. On a recent visit to Moosonee, he told me something that continues to devastate me, that sounds unbelievable, it's so brutal. Over a 6-month period recently, there were at least 100 suicide attempts among teens in Moosonee, and many others in the neighboring reserve of Moose Factory. At last count, 8 youth in Moosonee had been successful. They'd hang themselves in closets, sometimes in trees behind the high school. It appears a death cult is taking root. More than 100 attempts, 8 suicides in a community of 2,500. Yes, it appears to be a death cult. If this statistic darkened non-Indian towns across, say, British Columbia or Manitoba or Prince Edward Island, if this epidemic struck one of our communities, it would be national news. The media frenzy so saturated that Canadians would suffer empathy burnout within months. My quick Google search, suicide rates on Canadian reserves, pulls 36,000 results in 0.28 seconds. Within minutes, I can learn that since at least the year 2000, many experts have declared that the northern reserves of our country are the suicide capitals of the world. Statistics on these pages, I think, quickly stun, then numb us. And the reasons why our Aboriginal youth are strangling themselves in closets, are shooting themselves in the head, or drowning themselves in icy rivers. A few more minutes of keyboard tapping on Google and it becomes so obvious. miserable socioeconomic conditions, psychobiological tendencies, the post-traumatic stress of a culture's destruction. And what can even begin to stem the tide of brutal loss? The one and only Family Services Centre in Moosonee, Payakateno, which serves all of the 14,000 Cree of the Ontario side of James Bay, almost had to close its doors a few years ago, not long after my good friend's children's suicides. That was due to a severe lack of government funding. It's expensive to try and furnish these services in such remote areas. The experts agree, though, that it's vital. I was told of 14 youth suicides on the west coast of James Bay back in 2009. 1 in 1,000 commits suicide that year. The Canadian average, I'm told, is 1 in 100,000. Suicide rates on the west coast of James Bay were 100 times higher than the Canadian average. And the only family services facility for the west coast of James Bay came within inches of closing its doors last year for a lack of funding. Before I paint such a painfully bleak picture, let me be clear that for each story of loss, there is a story of accomplishment, of perseverance. Here's one. While wandering around the Forks that week many years ago, during the first Truth and Reconciliation gathering, I ran into a young man, Patrick Etherington Jr. from Moosonee, a man I've known since he was a boy. In fact, for much of 1 year, I homeschooled him. After a brief catching up, he told me something startling. Over a month ago, he and his father, Patrick Sr., along with a few friends, took a train from Moosonee to Cochrane and then began walking. They walked over 1,600 kilometers in just over 30 days in order to get here for this first annual gathering. Along the way, they talked to strangers, explaining that they were walking for the people, that this was their own little way of helping to begin shutting that door that was opened when the first doors of the residential schools in Canada began opening 150 years ago. Patrick Sr., his father, is a man I've held in great regard for 20 years. When I lived in Moosonee so long ago and became close friends with the Etherington family, Patrick Sr. shared with me some very tough and, yes, shocking stories of his years at St. Anne's in Fort Albany, one of Ontario's most infamous residential schools. And now here he is, walking with 4 young people across a substantial part of Canada because he understands that the epidemic I speak of is contagious, and one way to protect your children is to engage with them in as direct a way as you can. What better way, then, to spend more than a month walking and talking and laughing and sharing the joys and pain of such an adventure? Our Truth and Reconciliation gatherings played out across Canada over 6 years, 6 chances for people to come together and share stories and discuss remedies and keep straining to shut that door. What I'm convinced of is this: the simple act of taking that first step on the highway with your father and best friends beside you, the tension of the fast-moving river through your paddle, the radiant heat in the moose's ribcage as you reach your arm to cut out its heart, the sound of Canada geese honking as they stretch their necks for the south, the tug of the pickerel as it takes your hook, the sickening grind of the outboard's prop as it touches submerged river rock. It's these simple experiences that contain medicine strong enough to start some healing, to start closing that door. Sometimes I catch myself dreaming about my Cree friends' 2 dead children. In my dream, they're still alive, and they're out in the bush paddling the Moose River together, sun on their shoulders and good power in their stroke. They're paddling north, I think, home to Moosonee. And although I can't see her, I know that their mother stands on the shore by town, waiting patiently for them to come into sight. Act 3, Venistus. For all of the pain I speak of, there is much beauty too. The status quo of the last 10 years in this country didn't work. The federal policies of the last 10 years, regardless of political bent, were a great affront to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. To ignore, and when that was no longer possible, to belittle and eventually attack, and then finally blame the victims of those policies that the federal government not just created but institutionalized is not very good policy. And then to ban something called the Transparency Act for banned council spending was an attempted coup de grace, and that kind of policy just doesn't work. And First Nations and Inuit and Métis response, the Indigenous response, idle no more. One of the first great social media experiments of the 21st century, peaceful round dances at shopping malls where thousands of people of all colors were invited to participate, huge and peaceful marches to bring awareness to the issues and policies gravely affecting us and especially our children, peaceful protests in the form of sit-ins and hunger strikes and 1,000-kilometer walks, all to draw awareness to the issues we face, to the disparity, to the lack of level playing field. Idle No More went global, and Idle No More was peaceful. It was patient. If there is one thing that is pan-Indian about the different original nations of this land, is that we are patient. And do keep in mind that the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, are not just some of the world's greatest warriors, but the creators of the great law of peace. And Idle No More was successful. How do I weigh that? How do I know that? We've forcefully and calmly, peacefully spoken as many nations that we not just ask but demand a change in policy regarding our Indigenous peoples. We clearly care and want to learn. Canadians care. A tide of pain is one way to look at 7 generations of residential schools, and an intergenerational tide of trauma followed, barreling into the 21st century. Well, tides recede, though, but it takes time and patience on all of our parts. And it takes what architects are best at, not just trying to teach, but to listen. When by far the fastest growing population in our nation, and by the way, estimates are approaching 2 million people in Canada who identify as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, our Indigenous youth are graduating at school at such abysmal rates, we know that we have a long way to go. It's a difficult journey, but we owe it to all of us, our own children and grandchildren, and the generations to come, to absolutely agree that we will not leave behind those who are struggling. After all, we as a nation are only as good as our most vulnerable, and it is no longer them versus us. If my father, who was a doctor and a war hero in the Second World War, and my mother, who was a prolific teacher, taught me anything, it is that it's simply never about me. It's about us. Your children are my children. Speaking of children, allow me to share one last story. I promise, it's short. It's about a very special place. I wrote it for my son, Jacob, who was recently diagnosed with cancer. Happily, he received CAT scan results back today of all days, and it appears the surgery was successful. Thanks. I'll pass that on to him. As much as it is about homes and housing and proper housing and housing that reflects where you come from, who you are, and safe housing and clean housing. It's as much about the land for First Nations people. And so this is what I wrote for my son. The Moose River's mouth is so wide that if you were on the big water of James Bay searching for it, you'd think it wasn't a river at all, but a great inlet. Dangerous waters there. Wind can whip up the shallow bay into monster waves. Strong currents, but it's the waves that have drowned so many. Water, like my son, shows its anger on the surface. This is the place that has inspired my writing, but it is more than that. This place that I love can be dangerous, but it is more than that too. My son and I, we like it better on the river than on the bay. Too many ghosts out on the big water. Don't get me wrong, plenty of ghosts on the river too, but they never felt as aggressive as the ones out there. You can appease the river ghosts easier with a sprinkle of tobacco and a few whispered prayers. You get out on the big water in a storm and a carton of Player's Light isn't going to help. And so my son and I, we stay on the rivers. Start at the mouth and follow the Moose River by traveling against its strong current. And in about 6 or 7 miles, you will hit Moosonee on the right and Moose Factory on the left. Moosonee is accessible only by train, Moose Factory by freighter canoe in summer and ice road in winter. I've heard visitors call Moosonee hardscrabble and Moose Factory a shining example of the reserve system. Go there, I urge you. Decide for yourself. Travel this river with my son and me. Push against the current heading south past the hydro wires and onto the Quatabahegan Rapids. Long rolling water dotted with submerged boulders. Good paddling, just tricky enough to keep your heart beating fast. You look down and all you see is black, the brown shoulders of big rocks just below flashing by and threatening to flip your canoe. Past the Quatabahegans are the sandy shores of the Negabo Islands. The river here is wide. Old campgrounds on the heads of the islands that go back more generations than I want to count. On a canoe trip once, my son and I wandered the beaches, and he bent down to find an eagle feather lying there, a gift for him. Good energy on those islands, a place of rest and comfort for ancestor travelers. A few miles past, and if you head left toward the sound of the crashing water, you find Allen Rapids. This is where the Abitibi pours into the Moose. Good rapids that challenge even the best paddlers. If you're coming down them, stay to the extreme left, hugging the sharp cliffs on the shore that rise up from the mist. Push south in the calmer water, past the islands so big they look like mainland. Sturgeon as large as a man nudge rocks below you, turning them over with their snub noses, sucking up crayfish. The black spruce and poplar and aspen are thick along the shores. The water is shallow despite the river's girth. Otter Rapids Generating Station, dozens of miles south, upriver, is part of the reason, opening its mouth once a day to ease the built-up tension behind its concrete, causing the river to rise and settle as if governed by tides. Above, ospreys glide and watch. 20 miles now of rock lead up to bush. Drinking creeks spill into the river, beaver dams up bigger creeks, moose and fox and marten and wolves on the land, pickerel and pike and sturgeon in the water. Pulp mills and loggers, they want this place. Well, not all of it. Just the land by the rivers where the choice trees grow. The loggers, they know that if they are to harvest the trees by the rivers and creeks, it will create mass erosion that will kill off the fish and then the land animals who hunt them. But they want it still, and they say that they will get it from the Cree. My friend William's camp, where the Onakawana slips into the Abitibi, is the most magical place I know. A couple of cabins on a ridge above the river where you can watch the endless flow of water below, the forest and the river giving us what we need to survive. The spring breakup thunders and sometimes sends the ice water so high it floods the camp. In autumn, we hunt moose grazing red willow on the shores. In spring, after spawn, we fish for pickerel and pike that feed all of us, enough for us to bring back gifts of thick fillets to elders in Moosonee and Moose Factory. In summer, my son and I paddle from Williams Camp with the current, paddle to friends in the north. In winter, we snowmobile up and down the frozen back of the river between Williams Camp and the bay. This stretch of water between James Bay and the Onakawana is where I bring my son when we need to reconnect again, when the trouble of his teenage years threatened to unground him and me, when the fear of cancer visited him at the age of 25, far too young for such an unwanted guest to come knocking. There's magic in this stretch of river, magic on the shores, no one else around but us. This place, it belongs to no one, to everyone, to those who respect it. These rivers and the lowlands around it are part of Mushkegowuk, the Moose Cree homeland. This magic, it passes through us, those who own nothing and everything. It has become a part of my son and of me. To conclude, after Hurricane Katrina, a strange brand of tourism emerged with busloads of gawkers flooding into places like the ravaged Lower Ninth Ward in order to witness firsthand the destruction. I, like many people living in that city, found it strange and kind of callous. But there are the good stories, too. Brad Pitt, who I know has a deep regard for architecture and is a part-time resident of the city, helped design and build sustainable homes in the Lower Ninth. Regardless of the esteem or lack thereof in which one holds Brad Pitt, what he did I find fascinating and incredibly honorable. He acted, and he did it in such a way that it gave agency back to the community while incorporating cultural value into it. I've stolen a bit from Alan's speech. Does that sound familiar, Alan? May I go so far as to suggest that you are our Canadian Brad Pitt? Please? Part of the reason I was so excited to come here tonight is as I read up on Alan, I read what he was writing, and I was blown away by the vision and the strength and the courage to say the things that he's saying. And so, miigwech. In all honesty, we need the brilliant minds such as are in this room tonight to join forces with our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities in reimagining and rebuilding those communities that are in such desperate need of it. This is probably one of the most powerful physical and concrete acts of reconciliation I can imagine. Sustainability and cultural sensitivity. These are not the terms we think of when we think of houses and communities like Szechuan, and especially neither are utilitas, firmitas, and venestus. But shouldn't they be? The destruction caused by residential schools in this country wasn't so much a hurricane, but an incredibly slow-moving tsunami, drowning families, destroying homes, wreaking havoc on whole communities. But the tsunami has finally reached its peak, and as it begins to recede, it's time for the architects to become beachcombers, walking through the detritus left in the tsunami's wake, gathering what is usable and useful, speaking with the inhabitants about what designs make most sense, and now that it's time to rebuild. The new homes won't much resemble the old ones. We can't rebuild like that, just like we can't go home again. But you are in an exciting place in our country's history. You have the chance to help dream up and construct homes that can be every bit as beautiful and useful and solid as the old ones, maybe even more so. So, Chi Miigwech, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph. That was absolutely extraordinary, and thank you for your wisdom, for sharing your stories with us, and your stories will certainly stay in our hearts, as will your son. So thank you for sharing with us. Alors, la cérémonie d'investiture est maintenant sur le point de commencer. I would like to invite Mr. Raymond Moriyama to join me at the podium. Mr. Moriyama is a Companion of the Order of Canada, RAIC Gold Medalist, and of course, the founder of the Moriyama RAIC International Prize. He will deliver the proclamation and the presidential citation. And I'd also like to invite Sam Obo and Alan Taramura to come up here for the investiture of the President and the presentation of the President's medals.
First of all, Happy New Year, everybody. I wish you all a healthy, happy, productive, creative 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a great honor for me to be standing here at this investiture. When I was first asked, I thought it was a revenge from Alan for talking him into joining the RAIC board some 50 moons ago. Before I start, Alan, I would like you to know that Maria Cook of the RAIC and your brother Daniel helped me with the information. But whatever I say is my responsibility. I'd like to start by asking a very simple question to the audience. It's a question about, did you know? Did you know that Alan's brother is an architect? His wife is an architect. His father-in-law is an architect. And I think his brother-in-law is an architect. So I think the profession runs in its genetic structure. Now, let me start by telling you a little bit about Alan's background. First of all, Alan is a registered architect for 25 years of experience. He is a principal at Watson McEwen Taramura Architects in Ottawa. And now I think I have to read this so that I don't miss the point. Recently, Alan has been responsible for the restoration of tropical greenhouse at the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa. Also, conservation work at the Amherst and Halifax armories. That's true. Moreover, ongoing work on Central Block on Parliament Hill, as well as various strategic planning studies of the parliamentary precinct. Now, as you know, Alan has been as it was stated earlier, Brad Pitt of Canada. And here we are. You know, there's a reason why we're here for this investiture. For the past 4 years, he served on the RAIC board as the RAIC Regional Director for Ontario East, North, and Nunavut. Over the years, he has also volunteered with the City of Ottawa, Local Architectural Conservancy Advisory Committee, and Canada Green Building Council. Now, Alan is a man of exceptional intelligence, humor, and design ability. His quiet competence, his talent, and great judgment brings honor to the profession. As he assumes leadership in the RAIC, I wish to recall the founding objective of the RAIC. RAIC, as most of you know, was formed in 1907. And the intention was to facilitate, first of all, the acquirement and interchange of professional knowledge amongst the members. Secondly, promote and conserve the honor and dignity of the profession. Thirdly, unify the various local organizations. Fourthly, create a spirit of spirit de corps. And finally, to raise the standard of the profession. These goals remain perhaps even more pertinent today in our really chaotic world than what it was in the beginning. And talking about raising the standard of the profession, I just want to make a commercial announcement on behalf of RAIC Foundation and myself, and that's to encourage everybody, architects, to submit any sort of worthwhile transforming type of architecture for the future, for this submission to the Moriama RAIC International Prize, which will happen this year. And of course, to students, there will be 3 scholarship awards. Now, Alan, I wish you, well, I'd like to say, may you have the strength, support, and guidance to uphold the mission of the RAIC and advance its activity to betterment of the profession and the public good. Honored guests, friends, members, fellows, and directors of the RAIC, I present to you Alan Taramura, the 77th President.
Okay, I think it's time for me to get this heavy thing off my head. Okay, yeah, stay with me. So, Alan, I present to you the Presidential Medal as the 76th President to the 77th President of the RAIC. Congratulations.
you the medal of the past president.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness. I think there's a very serious risk I'm going to become intolerable after this evening. So I'd like to thank Raymond for encouraging me to put my name forward for the position of the RAIC president. When an RAIC gold medalist, Order of Canada recipient, and distinguished professional honors you with this kind of advice, you don't really have a choice. And actually, Ray, I think you even told my mom that I should do this at one point. And as vice president, I've already had a chance to experience the rewards and challenges that go with helping to lead an organization like this. So I'm looking forward to the next 12 months. Great deal. And I'd also like to thank Joseph for joining us here tonight. His novels really did help me to understand Northern Ontario as a place, as I was struggling to come to terms with the challenges confronting the people who call this place home. And Dr. Chris Manson, thank you for attending, and I do look forward to our ongoing collaborations with the NCC. And Douglas Cardinal, thank you as architect of this space of ceremony. And Sam, thank you for raising expectations for my performance to levels that I'm almost guaranteed to fail to meet. So I have the ceremony here in this space. It might seem odd for many of you since I'm not of Indigenous background. The year I was first elected to the board as a director for Ontario North, East, and Nunavut was the year the James Bay community of Attawapiskat was in the news due to a fire that displaced many of its residents. As this community was in the region that I represented, and as our organization advocates for excellence in the built environment, I felt I needed to understand better what was going on there, as it clearly was not anything like excellent. Although I read what I could, it was clear to me that visiting the region and speaking to community members would really be the only way I could really understand. Finding an appropriate way and time to visit took many inquiries and meetings, including then Aboriginal Affairs critic Dr. Caroline Bennett. But it was Charlie Angus, Member of Parliament for Timmins James Bay, who made a seat available for me on one of his charter flights to Saskatchewan and introduced me to the local community members. I actually still find it difficult to talk about this experience. Beyond the condition of the individual buildings, it was the needlessly harsh, austere, internment camp-like atmosphere that troubled me. As we all know, as professionals, built environments don't just happen. They're the work of trained professionals, administrators, and policymakers. It's a choice. Although it must be said, in this case, not likely one made by architects. Khalil Sharif, Executive Director of the Aga Khan Foundation, Canada, once told me that His Highness, the Aga Khan, values professional associations like ours because they represent the competencies of a nation. That's quite a responsibility. It's a powerful idea that has stuck with me ever since. So as a representative of one of these organizations that represents Canada's competency in the built environment, how does this responsibility come into play when confronted with what appears to be long-term institutionalized incompetence? I'm not referring to professional malpractice, but a more profound failure to understand or even respect the community they're attempting to serve. Out of my depth, I looked for help. Before my trip north, at a conference on Indigenous reconciliation, I spoke with one of the presenters, who's here tonight, Dr. Marilyn Poitras, a Métis law professor from the University of Saskatchewan, who has since served as a great sounding board and resource in understanding the issues at play. Also, I learned that the RAIC has among its members a small but growing cohort of Indigenous practitioners. So we formed a task force led by Patrick Stewart of the Stolo First Nation in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia to examine ways to approach the creation of healthy and sustainable Indigenous communities. The members of this task force are uniquely qualified because of their Indigenous background and professional training to provide informed advice on how the profession and also to public policymakers on how to work more responsibly in these communities. The RAIC can use its national reach and access to media to amplify their voices. Our foundation has also established a scholarship for Indigenous students to study architecture and building technology. As architects, I think we would all agree that losing knowledge of traditional building crafts and ways of organizing space for cultural purposes can be as corrosive to a society as the loss of a spoken language. And yet, the built environment in Indigenous communities tends to be discussed in terms of housing issues and other technical matters. In my view, the problem is also the absence of cultural identity in Indigenous community plans imposed by governing authorities, and this is seldom discussed. The testimonials from the residents of Uje Bugamu, a community designed by Douglas Cardinal in collaboration with its residents, clearly demonstrates the healing power of culturally responsive architecture. Sadly, this example has never been repeated. Giving agency back to the communities themselves and incorporating cultural value in every investment made in places like this are the only way to turn places like Kashechuan and Attawapiskat into sustainable, healthy communities. And what a thrill to be quoted by a favorite author from my own writing. At a time when talk of reconciliation is growing, our profession is in a position to, and therefore obligated to, look for ways to help address injustices, not by imposing ideas, but by listening and promoting professional competencies that already exist in Indigenous communities. I hope to continue to advance this issue during my term as president and establish it as a permanent part of the Institute's advocacy agenda. So that's why we're here in this space. Of course, there are other challenges facing the country and our profession in 2016. Just one example is that after the Paris Climate Summit, it appears possible that we may be entering a period of reconciliation with the planet itself. Architects are well positioned to assist Canada to achieve its targets in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And the RAIC will be giving greater voice to thought leaders within our profession, or within our membership. The building sector is ready and able to do its part, and we need to make sure that this happens. So thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would now like to introduce the 2016 Board of Directors of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. This group of volunteers works hard to ensure that the RAIC fulfills its mandate of being the national voice for Canadian architects and advocating for the excellence in the built environment. They represent every region in the country and are actively engaged with their local communities. So as I call your names, you can come up and stand here. Please welcome Eva Bieniecka, MIRAC, First Vice President. Michael Cox, FRAIC, Second Vice President and Regional Director, Alberta, Saskatchewan. Samuel Obo, PPFRAIC, Past President. John Brown, FRAIC, Regional Director, Alberta, Northwest Territories. Les Klein, FRAIC, Regional Director, Ontario Southwest. Emmanuel Van Rooten, MRAIC, my successor as Regional Director, Ontario Northeast and Nunavut. Jonathan Bisson, MIRAC, Regional Director, Quebec. Tyler Lowen, MRAIC, Director representing interns and intern architects. And Barry Johns, FRAIC, Chancellor of the College of Fellows. Unfortunately, there are 3 members who are unable to be with us tonight. They are Jennifer Cutbill, MRAIC Regional Director, BC Yukon, Carol Rogers, MRAIC Regional Director, Atlantic, and Jill Stoner, Director representing Canadian Council of University and Colleges. So, thank you all. I'm looking forward to working with you in 2016.
Great, thanks very much. That concludes the formal part of our program. Merci de votre présence à l'investiture du 77e président de l'Institut royal d'architecture du Canada. We look forward with great excitement to working with you, Alan. I think that the whole country is really raring and waiting to go. So before letting you go, though, I should tell you that Joseph Boyden has very kindly agreed to a book signing. And so bring your copies, and if you didn't bring some, they are conveniently for sale, just at the back on the right here. And as well, please do visit the exhibition that's on the upper floor, the mezzanine level. It's a living monument for the residential school survivors. The Wabano Centre worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Legacy of Hope Foundation to bring it to life. So thank you very much for being here tonight, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Bonne soirée. Merci.